From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Roberta Schaefer, and I have the privilege of serving as the Law Librarian of Congress. And it is indeed my pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to our program marking the 500th anniversary of the establishment of the Venice Ghetto. It's quite appropriate, actually, that the Library of Congress be the venue for this commemoration. And as many of you already know, Venice, during the period that it was a ghetto, so up until 1797, when that 20-something Napoleon Bonaparte lifted the floodgates, it was a flourishing commercial publishing center. Many, many arts and much literature and music was created and disseminated from the Venice Ghetto. And it had quite a contribution to the life of the Venetian Republic and the life of the whole region around it. But probably the most important reason for us to be the venue to begin this commemoration is the fact that it was kind of a melting pot. Now, many of you know that the word ghetto is associated, at least originally by many, with the Venice Ghetto as the first instance of that term being used. But there is, I understand, some controversy about the origin of the word. This region, which was the confined community that became the Venice Ghetto, years before had been the foundry works of that region. And I like to think that that's the origin from the Italian word, because in many ways it really signifies the melting pot that the Venice Ghetto was. And also that it was a place that much culture and commerce was forged. So if you'll excuse my being a bit punnish this afternoon, that is why I prefer to think that the term foundry was indeed the reason for the creation. And the Library of Congress itself is a great melting pot of intellectual creation. As many of you, I hope, know, we have over 165 million items representing over 420 languages. We have maps, manuscripts, movies, and of course, books and many, many other artifacts of intellectual creation and the history of humanity. So for all of these reasons, we are delighted to be hosting this commemoration this afternoon, and we welcome you, and we hope you will have the opportunity at the end of the program to view a really small sampling of the wonderful treasures that are part of the Library of Congress collections that are relevant to the topic that we will discuss today, and looking at the topic through a very long lens of how what our scholars will share with us has relevance to contemporary life. So speaking of contemporary life, it is indeed an honor to welcome the new ambassador to Washington from Italy, His Excellency Armando Varricchio, who has had many, many posts. He served in Budapest, in Belgrade, he's been in Brussels, served his own foreign ministry as an equivalent of an undersecretary very recently, and is coming back to Washington for the second time. He was here a number of years ago as the economic advisor to the Embassy of Italy. He is marking this year his 30th anniversary in civil service. So although we're marking a 500th anniversary today, we're also marking a 30th anniversary. He came to civil service after a brief stint in the private sector. We are delighted by the relationship that we have through the cultural attaché, Renato Miraco, with the embassy, and we know that our new ambassador will continue the tradition. He has a phenomenal intellectual curiosity. This is not his first trip, even though he just came to Washington, to the Library of Congress. And so we are absolutely honored that he is with us this afternoon. Your Excellency.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Roberta, for this very, very warm and friendly welcome here. You're right, this is not the first time I'm here. I had the privilege to attend an event a few weeks ago, and this shows the importance that I attach to this great institution, the Library of Congress. We are celebrating today 500 years, a great anniversary, when Leonardo Loredan, the Doge of Venice, the ruler of Venice, and the Venetian Senate, in an early spring day, March 1516, in Venice, decided that the Jewish community had to be segregated in an old part of the city, close to an area that we call Canareggio. They were not aware that that decision was conducive to change history in a way. I don't want to enter into the pronunciation of the word ghetto or ghetto. I think that we should have glottologists working on it. But it is true that we tend to believe that because of the location, because that part of the city was an industrial site, a foundry, from that very name, we nowadays have been accustomed to use this word ghetto. The idea of the Venetian rulers was to segregate people. And this is one of the topics that we have been discussing today. La città degli ebrei, the city of Jews, segregated space, and admission of strangers in the Jewish ghetto. But what does segregation mean, actually? It might sound paradoxically that a city like Venice was a winner of the that time globalization. We tend to believe that the globalization is a very recent world. This is not the case. Venice was a truly globalized city. You had a Venetian ship ruling the waves in what was called the Venetian Sea, and now we are accustomed to name Adriatic Sea. They were sailing throughout the Mediterranean, down to the east, the areas that we now call Syria, the great city of Constantinople. So they were particularly open to different cultures, different ideas, different religions. But nonetheless, they decided to segregate a community. What is particularly intriguing is to think about segregation today, because we do think that that community made out of very talented people. There were merchants, there were intellectuals, there were bankers. They responded in the best possible way. They did continue their journey. And their journey, and the journey that we can admire here with the display of this great piece of art, the books that, thanks to the library, we will enjoy, was a journey throughout their mind, throughout their spirit. This means that you can segregate people, you can close a border, but you cannot segregate your mind. Thanks to their ability, to their deep knowledge, to their great personality, those people that were not different from anybody, they were part of the society, they were an active part of the society, continued their journey. They produced ideas, they wrote about law, about the arts, about daily life, so they remain an active part of the society. And by the way, Venice should not have been the same without the great contribution of the Jewish Venetian. They were a very, very dynamic component of the society. Since then, we have become accustomed to have different ghettos, not just of Jewish, but in other parts of the societies. And still we tend to use this word. We are in the Library of Congress, so we tend to read books. But books are so useful to us. Cicero used to say that historia magistra vitae. Because of history, we can learn to better understand our present. The historians have a great privilege. They look into the past and they offer us opportunities to think about the present. It is not up to historians to say what we should do nowadays and what should do particularly in the future, but they are offering us a correct reading. And I think that we will enjoy listening to great contributions of very prominent scholars. Afterwards, some of you will have the opportunity to receive the great treat that I received by looking at those books. But first and foremost, I think that by going back to that early spring day of 500 days, we will have opportunities to think about our present, and particularly what lays in front of us. Thank you very much for having me here.
Good evening. I'm Natalia Indrimi, the director of the Centro Primo Levi in New York. I'd like to thank Roberta Schaeffer and the Ambassador Varricchio, Renato Miracco, for inviting us to participate in this event, which I believe will, and I hope will be is the beginning of a fruitful collaboration with the Library of Congress. Our center has been active in New York for about 18 years, presenting the work of Primo Levi as well as the history of Italian Jews. The history of Italian Jews and the particular combination of the lens through which Primo Levi has portrayed it and transmitted it to the public all over the world is especially symbolic. We are talking about one of the smallest and longest living minorities in the world, which Jews have lived in Italy for over 22 centuries, and have been always in the range of between 30 and 50,000 people. So a very, very small population that has not assimilated at all, but integrated and coexisted, been influenced and influencing the Italian society to a very high degree. After the tragedy of the Shoah, which Primo Levi has brought to us in very unique, universal terms, the way in which the history of this minority becomes symbolic is to show what a small group of people who are different but fully participatory do to a larger society. As the ruling systems, as the forms of governments change in that country. And I think that by studying the relationship between Italian Jews and Italy as a combination of smaller states and then as a unified country, there is a lot that we can gain in trying to understand the world today and how we, in a melting pot, relate to each other and to the larger society in which we live. The way in which our center works is by supporting programming, both academic and public, and publishing. We have an online magazine, Printed Matter, that is free for everybody to enjoy, and a small publishing house. What we provide for the academic world and the general public is an interface with enormous treasure of Italian libraries and archives that are also extremely well organized through a unified portal called SIUSE, and that anybody from here or from anywhere in the world today can access. What's always surprising and interesting is to see the traveling of books. I mean, what we have in Italy has often an interlocutor. A book that is in Italy as an interlocutor in a library in the United States. There is no library in the United States, and here we have, of course, the most precious example of Italian collection here, but that doesn't feature a piece of the history of Italian Jews. Some in very important ways, like the Jewish Theological Seminary Library, which, by the way, was founded by an Italian rabbi, Sabato Morais, to smaller libraries like Columbia and the Library of Congress, the Strashun Libraries at Ivo, that is by 80% of Italian origin. And the fact that it's such a small population has left a legacy that we can find and follow, and in so many different places, I think is per se something to reflect upon and something to investigate. The history of traveling of each of this book and what they did to the place and where they landed, and the students that were able to read them, is very much an important part of our culture and our society, and something that we always ought to remember, because the destiny of books and libraries is always uncertain, especially when we are in times of crisis. People tend to diminish what books do, and instead our base is even in the face of very, very basic needs. I'm going to leave the podium to our distinguished speakers, and I just want to add that I hope very much that the books that are here at the Library of Congress of Italian and Italian Jewish origin, and the books that are in Italy and whose libraries are featured in our website and in others, will begin new dialogues and continue the dialogues that have been initiated so far by scholars like Bernard Cooperman, who has been a champion of bringing the history of Italian Jews here in the United States. Again, thank you very much, and please welcome our speakers.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Welcome, Ambassador. Thank you, Roberta. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I am a professor by profession, right? That's what I do for a living, which means that I can only speak in 50-minute blocks. And they've only given me 30 minutes. So I'm going to talk very fast now, and then you'll understand, and you'll have to slow it down on the tape afterwards to understand what I said. Okay. So let me try. First of all, let's put on a picture here. How do we do it? Oh, there we are. Okay. Can you see that? Yeah. All right. So I'm going to skip around, and I'm just going to try to hit some highlights to try to make sense out of this. So forgive me if I'm too fast, and I assume there'll be time for questions afterwards, and we can do it. And I'll try to also let you know about some of the things you'll be able to see in the room out there, what they are, and so forth and so on. So the first question is, what is a ghetto, and what do we assume it to be? We assume for most people, and the ambassador put it very well, there is a sense of segregation. There is a sense, if you ask the average person, most people, if you ask in America what is a ghetto, they don't know it has anything to do with Jews. They think the ghetto is the inner city, it's African Americans, it's Latinos. In America, the word has lost its Jewish connotation. But if you ask my students who know anything about Jewish history, they will tell you the ghetto is a terrible period, and the ghetto gives its name to the pre-modern world. There's a very famous article that is called Ghetto and Emancipation, as if all the Jews lived in a ghetto and then they were let out, right? Then they were let free. Who let the dogs out, or who let the Jews out, right? So all the Jews run out of the ghetto and suddenly they become a part of the modern world. And so there is a sense that the ghetto was an enclosure, was an expulsion from society. There is one absolutely horrifying book by a very well-known social scientist from New York, whose name I won't mention, but if you look in my articles, you'll see him, and who compares the ghetto, if you'll excuse me, to a condom that protects society from the Jews who are germs and that. This is insane. It's absolutely nuts. But it is part of a narrative of Jewish history that says the Jews used to be excluded, the Jews used to be punished, and then suddenly, perhaps with the French Revolution, perhaps the American Revolution, perhaps with the Austrian Edicts of Tolerance, that suddenly they were let out. So there's this notion of expulsion and exclusion. And the idea was that the Jews were excluded from not only the contact with the outside world, but from the culture of the outside world. It was a sense then that the Jews gained their legal rights of citizen, and once they became a citizen, discrimination was over. We are now, the Messianic era has come. Now, in that story, what is the assumed motive for the ghetto? Why did they create a ghetto? Well, first of all, we all know that everybody hated the Jews. Anybody here who remembers Tom Lehrer may remember that wonderful song about National Brotherhood Week, and the black folks hate the white folks, and the white folks hate the black folks, and everybody hates the Jews, right? So it's a kind of a narrative that Jews and other people have come to tell, and that narrative, of course, has been emphasized by the Holocaust and by everything else. We say, they always hated the Jews, they always persecuted the Jews. Why did they hate the Jews? That's obvious. They hated the Jews because the Jews weren't Christians, because they killed Christ. They are deicides. They are condemned forever. Let his blood be upon our hands for all times, right? That's the account of the crucifixion, and so forth. And that becomes, and this is very important, and I hope you won't see me as just an idiot talking in big words or big phrases. This is actually extremely important to emphasize. The idea that this hatred is age-old. We now call it anti-Semitism, right? Which is, in fact, a new word. It was made up in the 19th century. It's a political term. It has very specific meanings, but we use it for everything. And we have all kinds of organizations in both the Jewish community and the non-Jewish community to stamp out anti-Semitism, to get rid of this age-old hatred that has only changed its face from time to time. It is arguably the only ahistorical idea in all historians' toolbox, right? The only thing that isn't subject to change is anti-Semitism. It just changes its rhetoric, but it's always there. Everybody always hates the Jews. So that's the first argument. The ghetto is an example of Christian anti-Semitism. The second argument is that it has to do with economics. Christianity was, because of a verse in the Bible and because of their interpretation of it, you shouldn't lend it interest to your brother. This was understood that Christians could not lend it interest to each other, and therefore Jews were let in. Of course, everybody hated them because you had to pay them interest, but the Jews were the only people in Christian society that were legally allowed to lend it interest. Let me tell you, first of all, you may have gathered from the way I presented anti-Semitism that I think that's a silly understanding of animosity between groups. But let me tell you about this business about money lending. It's absolute nonsense. It is not true that there was no credit in medieval Christian society. How do you think Venice traded all over the world? If you were sending out a boat, believe me, you tried to share the risk. Believe me, the merchants invested. They had contracts that were written in ways that theoretically hid the fact that there was interest. Real interest was not what Jews were involved in. The real money that ran society, the real money that governments borrowed, bonds and so forth, that wasn't a Jewish business. There are a few Jews here and there, but that's very unusual. What Jews are doing is providing what we use credit cards for today. That is, they were providing consumer credit, right? And they were providing it to relatively poor people. Now, I assume that some people will walk away saying Cooperman, that's me, is an anti-Semite. My mother would be surprised because she raised me Jewish. But be that as it may be, I want to assure you that the kind of credit that Jews did, and this is very important to my story, the kind of credit the Jews did was an ugly kind of credit. I don't mean that the Jews were ugly people. I don't mean that they were nasty. I mean that that kind of credit is horrifying in its results. Why? Because poor people need it. And when poor people get involved in loans, no matter how low the rate of interest, think about check cashing places. Think about the Labor Department just put out a report about people who borrow against their car. The average borrowing against a car in this country is for $700. And 40% of those loans result in the car being repossessed because people get tied up and they get hung up in it and there's no way out. So you have to remember that although it was a profitable business, although it was a very specific business, the reason Jews are admitted to do this is, first of all, because even though money lending is legalized in Europe, it's a myth that there was no legal money lending. And there are notarized texts that show that money is being lent and so forth. Please, by the way, somebody tell me when I'm out of time here, because I looked at my watch. I think I started at 20 after, but I'll forget. I keep looking down. But Jews what happens is that even though it is legal to do, no one wants to do it, right? Because it's a hard business. You have to go dun people for the money. Very often the people you've lent money to can't afford to pay you back. Of course, you need the money too, right? It's your money. It's just one of those businesses that Christians didn't like to do. We know, by the way, that many Christian wealthy people invested money with the Jews and made money off of this too. In other words, they lent money to the Jew, who then lent money to the poor people, right? It's never that simple, and we could go on for an hour and a half just about the nature of the credit business. But the bottom line is that societies need that service. At the same time, I want to stress this, that kind of money lending has three elements in it that are very important. First of all, that kind of money lending will be something that the society itself, the government, will have a stake in making cheaper and cheaper. They will try to keep it as cheap as possible. The people who are lending the money are trying to make money from people who will probably never pay them back. Right? So it's a very thin margin here, even though it looks like a horrifying thing. But as a result of that, because there is pressure, there is always going to be pressure to force down the rate of interest. The Jews are going to want to live in areas where there are a lot of customers. The government will use that to force them to accept a lower rate of interest. In Venice, within a relatively short time, the Jewish community was subsidizing the banks. The Jews were admitted to lend money at interest to the poor people, but fairly soon the Jews were subsidizing their own banks because the rest of the community needed the banks to exist in order to be able to live in the city, right? Very few people actually own these little pawn shops or banks, whatever we want to call them. But because there's this pressure from the government to lower the rate, nobody will take the job because it doesn't make a living. So the Jews pay loan bankers significant sums to open banks that don't make a profit. So that's the first thing you want to understand. The second, and it's interesting how all these things work. The second thing is, think about Trump University and how they made money, right? Okay, so I don't know why that came up. The second... Democrats. The second point you want to understand is that these pawn shops, these little places where somebody will bring their stuff to sell, they are often selling what we would call seconds or end of cloth or out-of-season goods, right? It's very important to remember this. So they're selling, in other words, off-brand stuff. Anybody here go to Marshall's? Okay, so you know what Marshall's is. Marshall's, you go in there and you buy last season's goods, or you buy things that have a few less threads per square inch in the knitting of in the weaving of the fabric and so forth and so on. You buy things that the company was trying to get rid of and so forth and so on. That is what Jews did. And remember, the economy of the early modern city is dominated by guilds. And these guilds control the manufacturing and the price and the quantity and the quality and everything. And Jews are not just lending money at interest, they are also, in effect, running a secondary market, a gray market. They are running the Marshall stores everywhere that they are allowed to live. Naturally, the guild merchants don't want the Jews there because they cut the price. On the other hand, it's nice to have somewhere to get rid of your extras, your end-of-season goods. And so the Jew serves, first of all, a function of providing economic relief to the poor. Second, with its problems. Second, they are selling and competing with established merchants. And the third thing that Jews are doing, and there's no doubt about this, and it sounds not nice, but I assure you it is true, is that these shops are fencing agencies. That is, the people who bring them things to pawn have often stolen those things, right? And that is a serious problem. And if you go into any used furniture store or any used clothing store, you had better believe that a large proportion of what is on sale there has not been, in one way, it's more complicated than simply saying it was stolen, but I assure you that a large part of it was not exactly there legally. All right? So that is a function of this kind of gray economy. It's an economy in used items, off-brand name items, and stolen material and things like that. Okay, so that is why Jews are let in. That is what they do. Now, in order then to take the next step, I want to say that what happens, if you want to understand what the ghetto is, the ambassador said quite correctly, there is a decision to exclude the Jews or to segregate the Jews, and that's quite true. But we have a word for that. We call those gated communities, right? Everybody laughs when I say that. But think about it. What is a gated community? I can live here and you can't, right? Now, you could say, yes, but the Jews would have rather lived somewhere else. How many Jews do you think lived in Venice before 1516? How many people vote? 300. I'll tell you that in 1516, 900 Jews were at one moment admitted into that ghetto. How many lived there in 1514? Or let's say 1500? Take a guess. How many people would say 500? How many people would say 1500? Nobody's saying anything. Come on, guys. You're like my classes. Who'll give me $1,500? 1,500 Jews. 1,500 Jews going once, 1,500 Jews going twice. How many people here would say, oh, there were only 500 Jews before the ghetto? Okay, I got what? How many? 300. Okay. You know what the real answer is? So what was the ghetto? It was a way of letting the Jews into Venice. Now, wait a minute. Where did the Jews live before? So let me try to show you some quick maps here, okay? This is a 1500 map of the city. There are no Jews yet. There's no ghetto in the city. There are no Jews in the city except people who come in on short-term peddling licenses and so forth. The ghetto is going to be, I don't know if is there no, there's nothing. Okay, so, but up at the top is where the ghetto is going to be established. Here you can see, this is a larger map. This is already 1550, and if you look at the top of the map, here, this is the area where the ghetto was established. As we heard, it was a foundry. It was an old industrial zone that had been opened up. Let me show on this side too, right? It's put in here. And now I want to show you something important for you to understand. We're going to skip that. I'll come back to that. Okay, the first ghetto was called, in Italian, the Ghetto Nuovo. The second ghetto was called, some people here speak Italian. The second ghetto was called the Ghetto Vecchio. Now, does that make sense? No, because the new ghetto shouldn't come before the old ghetto, unless you realize that the word ghetto means foundry. And as we heard, it means a foundry or a melting pot. I like that. I'm going to use that in my next talk and not admit I stole it from you. But the ghetto, the first area that the Jews were given was an old industrial area. They were given that area to live in, and that area is called the Ghetto Nuovo. That's how we really know the word comes from Venice. There are a lot of theories about maybe it came from somewhere else. That's baloney. If you look down below, here I'll favor this side. If you look down here, this is the Ghetto Vecchio. The first ghetto was established in 1516. By 1541, the Jews need more space, and so they are given the second space. Understand, I said to you the Jews were admitted because they provided money lending, and they provided peddling, and they were part of that extended gray market. The old ghetto, which is the newer ghetto, right, the Ghetto Vecchio, which is in fact the newer ghetto, was established for Jews who are bringing the trade of the Ottoman Empire into Venice. It is for Levantine merchants, and that is an indication of how Venice, which had once, as the ambassador quite correctly said, once dominated the Eastern Mediterranean. Venice owned the Eastern Mediterranean, right? By this point, the Ottomans have become so powerful that Venice is now forced, if it wants the rights for its merchants to trade in Istanbul or Constantinople, that it becomes Istanbul, they have to also admit Ottoman subjects. So this ghetto, this second ghetto, is an extension that is given to the Jews who are coming from the Ottoman Empire. Now, if you look up in the third area, you can see the Ghetto Nuovo, which is the kind of pinky square. The bluish thing down below is the Ghetto Vecchio. If you look at the yellow up on the right, that is the newest ghetto. By 1633, the word ghetto had come to mean not a foundry, but the place where Jews live. And so by that point, when they give the Spanish and Portuguese Jews a new ghetto, they get it, and it is called the newest ghetto. That is 1633, and that is an attempt by Venice to get access to the huge imperial trade of the Iberian empires, right? You know, we talk about the American empire and we bemoan the fact that perhaps the American empire is over, but it was a very short-lived empire, right? It was a very short empire, maybe 50, 60 years. If you want to take it back to First World War, maybe. But Spain ran the world for 250 years. That's what you call an empire. That's how to build an empire. Those Hispanics, don't let them in. They'll take, oh, I'm sorry. It's just, I live on CNN. What can I tell you? Okay. So there's another thing. And here is the entryway into that ghetto. Now, and that's just another map of it. Now, let me, what do I have left? I have about 10 minutes left, something? Okay, so not bad, not bad. I'll only leave out 3/4. Okay, now, what I want to stress to you is this. I used the term gated community, and obviously, you know, everybody laughed. What are you talking about? Gated communities are for fancy people. Thank you. This is an admission of Jews. Now, would the Jews have liked to have places somewhere else? Sure. Sure they would have. In fact, in 1509, Jewish moneylenders were already negotiating for spots on the Rialto, for places to live right on the Rialto, at the bridge, the main commercial hub, the Wall Street of Venice. And instead, they got this place. But would Jews have preferred no ghetto? No, don't be silly. Because first of all, it gave them a place of their own. It gave them the right to live in the city. The community, there are rumors that the community got to be as big as 5,000 Jews. And there's a wonderful lecture that I heard by a man named David Cassuto, who was once the vice mayor of Jerusalem. He's an architect who figured out that there literally was not enough space in the ghetto for everybody to sleep at the same time. If there were 5,000 Jews, it just wasn't that big. And so he had this whole theory the Jews slept in shifts. Schlepped in shifts. I don't know. Whatever they did, right? They lived there. But it's not so. The community was probably never much more than 2,500 Jews. There were bigger Jewish communities. Rome's Jewish community got to about 8,000, and Livorno's Jewish community on the other side of the peninsula got to be about 5,000. Amsterdam was close to 5,000. Prague may have been as much as 10 or 15,000. So, but Venice is one of the biggest cities in one of the biggest Jewish cities in Europe and one of the richest and wealthiest. Now, I just want, I'm going to skip this. I just want to show you a couple of pictures of synagogues in the Venetian ghetto. If you haven't been there, go. They're quite remarkable. This is the Ashkenazi synagogue. This is the outside of the Spanish synagogue, which was built a little bit later. This is the Canton synagogue. The pictures aren't that great because I took them off the web and I don't have very good ones. Okay, so now let me now sum this up. I've got about 5 minutes left, so let me see if I can bring this together for you to make some sense of it. What did it mean that the Jews were given their own city, their own business, that these are people whom Venice needs and wants, and attracts. The first thing I want you to understand is it does not mean, we always talk about it in terms of rights, toleration, assimilation, getting along, going together. Don't be silly. This is a society which is defined by ethnic and religious factors. And people did not. They may have crossed those lines on a daily basis. At night when they slept with somebody, we can never tell what they're doing. And believe me, everybody's sleeping with everybody. Especially during Carnival. But these are segregated societies in a way that our society doesn't know how to deal with. We live in a segregated society. Not as much as it was 30 or 40 years ago. But you look around, look at residential neighborhoods, and you see that people tend to live in groups. And we have an ideology in our society of openness, right? I moved to this country from Canada at a time when the Civil Rights Act was the country literally tore itself apart to try to maintain and foster and build up that ideology when it came to racial segregation, right? But the whole idea of this country is this ideology, and we think that's the norm. It's not the norm here, and it certainly is not the norm in other societies. And we somehow say they're immoral. No, they're not immoral, because the anxieties of groups that are separate, living next to each other in crowded urban situations, is always real. You can work against it. You can try to articulate an ideology of openness. But in this society, nobody thought that everybody should be the same. And remember, please, this is very important to remember. I started out by saying everybody knows that Christians hate the Jews. If it weren't for the Christianity, Judaism would not have survived in Europe. If it weren't for the church, Judaism would have been eradicated. The church has an ideology that says the world will be saved by the ultimate redemption of the Jews. And as a result, the church worked consistently. There were exceptions here or there, but consistently, church teaching is that the Jews must be fostered and protected and kept within the society, because they are the ultimate redemption of mankind. If you'll ask me, a Jew, I think it's I know Jews. I wouldn't make them the redemption of nothing. But the Christians have a mishigas, a craziness. Non posso, come si dice in italiano, mishigas? Una stranezza si dice. Yeah, but it is a Catholic doctrine. So it's very important to remember that. That doesn't mean there isn't anxiety. But where does that leave us? I want to just end off with a couple of quick points. First of all, what was mentioned before, the idea that the Jews had their own city, that this was the Città dei Libri. The Jews had their own city, and therefore, they had obligations there. They had to control behavior there. There are legal implications. Jews were in charge of the streets. Jews were in charge of crime. Jews were in charge of membership. Jews would keep some Jews out and allow certain Jews in. I want to show you one of the most famous characters from the ghetto of Venice. His name, you'll see his book out there. He wrote one second, let me show you the title page. His name is Meir Ben Gavriel. His first name was Meir, a good Hebrew name, but he was born in Maggio, in May, and so in Italian they called him Maggino. Maggino Gabrieli was quite a character, and in the 16th century, there you see a picture of him in the middle. You can see that he's dressed in the latest, most fashionable clothes. He does not have a badge. He does not have a long beard. He does not have a hat, because he's an Italian Jew and they didn't bother with all that stuff. And what did he do? He taught Italians how to make a second crop of silkworms each year. How did you do it? By keeping the batchi, the little worms, warm. Where did you keep them warm? Well, there were women, and they had dresses, and you could keep them. And so here you see a picture from his book of him handing that little sack. You see the little sack in the woman's hand? That's full of little silkworm cocoons, and she gives it to her neighbor, and the neighbor gives it to the next lady, and the lady is there ready to bring the worms into bed with her, right, and keep them there. And if you think that's a craziness, it's not, because in fact we have travelers who say that this was quite regularly done. It was one of the ways that Italians got 2 sets of silkworms each year and improved their produce. But now you can look at Maggino, and Maggino is a character. He's obviously a character. Look at how he's dressed, look at what he is here, and he really is one of the most fascinating people of the Venetian ghetto. But he is typical in a very interesting way. He's not an intellectual. He is not a rich merchant. He is an operator. He's one of those guys they make movies about on Wall Street. You know, he's one of these guys who's always got a new idea. He got the Pope's sister to invest in his idea. He got Ferdinando de' Medici to invest in his idea. He was sure he was going to build everything. And he also made himself a consul of the Jewish nation. And this Jew from Venice, gets the Medici to give him the right to bring as many Jews as he wanted to Venice's rival, the city of Livorno on the other side of the country, and to be their chief fellow. Within about 1 year, the Jews there say, "You're our what?" And they throw him out, and they rewrite their constitution so that no more is this charlatan or this operator running things. And like a lot of people who dream of making a lot of money, he's eventually thrown out. But I want to go back just to a very different Jew, and this is the fellow that I mentioned before, that I passed over before, Leon Modena. Leon Modena, and this is my last point, Leon Modena was born in the ghetto of Venice in 1571. He lived there his entire life. Every time he left, all he could dream about was coming back to the ghetto. He dreamed of the ghetto. He loved the ghetto. And he was an unbelievable failure. He was a famous rabbi. He spoke, he wrote, he was friends with the ambassadorial class in Venice. He wrote books that were published in French and in English and so forth and so on. He wrote in Hebrew, and he was a terrible failure, primarily because he was addicted to gambling. And as a gambler, he lost every cent he ever made. At one point, he was giving 4 sermons every Saturday in different synagogues in the ghetto, and he went through the money like water because he gambled. He wasn't gambling just for nothing. Gambling was a problem in the ghetto. And I want to mention, as I end this thing, I really am coming to the end, I promise, Stefano mi dispiace, I'm stealing his time. His sons, one of his sons died from alchemical experiments. He was trying to make a quick buck, and he poisoned himself with arsenic and ended up bleeding to death. Second son left the city, was captured by the Turks. He's actually expelled from the city for gambling and alcohol abuses. He leaves. He eventually ends up in Livorno, where he has to write to his father because he's now a prisoner, a slave, and the father sends money, but the kid never comes to visit him. The third son is a boy named Zebulon. It's his pride and joy. He calls him Zebulon because the Bible says that Zebulon was a tribe that lived on the sea, and they live in Venice, and it's on the sea. And this is a boy who sang in the synagogue choir, and he's wonderful. And then the boy gets involved in gangs in the ghetto, and he gets in a fight with the head of the gang over a prostitute, and he's stabbed on the street, and they run and call his father, this old rabbi here, and he comes and he's holding his head in his lap as the boy dies. Now, what I want you to understand then is that the ghetto was many things. It was not a condom. It was the city of the Jews. But that means that it had all the complications and all the pluses and minuses of cities. It had intellectuals, it had merchants, it had gang fights, it had prostitutes, it had robbers, it had theft, it had selling goods on the sly. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the ghetto. And the book that I'm working on right now has as its subtitle, The Ghetto of Venice, The Birthplace of Jewish Modernity. Thank you very much. And I now introduce Professor Stefano Villani, who knows much more about Venice than I do.
Thank you. Thank you so much to the Library of Congress and to the Embassy for having organized this event. It's always difficult to speak after Bernie. And actually, in my talk, I'm asking whether there were ghettos for non-Catholic Christians. To answer to this question, we must therefore first address the issue of what was the Protestant presence in Italy in early modern times. The Reformation, as is known, dates from 1517, the year following the establishment of the Ghetto of Venice, when Martin Luther, on the eve of All Saints, put out his 95 Theses at Wittenberg. Luther's work quickly circulated throughout whole Germany and Europe. Already in 1520, the first anti-Lutheran text, the Apologia pro Veritate Catholiche Apostoliche Fidei of the Dominican Ambrogio Cotarino Politi, was published in Italy, at Florence, spreading information about the German religious debate among Italians. Lutheran ideas spread in Italy among religious orders, and in particular in the Augustinian one, to which formerly Luther himself belonged. Reform ideas circulated since the 1530s in many areas of Italy. Significant reform groups formed in Venice, grace to a political elite which claimed its autonomy, from Rome, in Ferrara, where the Duchess Renée of France offered protection to heterodox and Calvinists, and in Lucca, where the entire city patriciate openly sympathized for the new ideas. Reform groups more or less structure are reported in Milan, Cremona, Como, Pavia, Udine, Padua, Vicenza, Modena. In Naples, in the 1540s, a spiritual circle that developed heterodox ideas without being openly Protestant gathered around the Spanish theologian Juan de Valdés, challenging traditional Catholic doctrines. The spreading of heresy in Italy led the Pope Paul III in July 1542 to organize a special committee of 6 cardinals with the task of proceeding against heretics, those suspected of heresy and those who held them. The Congregation of the Holy Office of the Roman Inquisition was born. The Holy Office, unlike the already existing Spanish and Portuguese Inquisition, which were born mainly in order to control the Jews and the Muslims who had converted to Catholicism, was so established to stop the diffusion of Protestant ideas in Italy. The congregation was given the task of creating a structure for tribunals all over the entire Italian peninsula. It was a heavily centralized institution. Everything was reported directly to Rome. Since Pius V pontificate, the practice that the Pope himself presided over the meetings of the cardinal once a week, usually on Thursday, was established. The congregation was also meeting once a week without the Pope, usually on Tuesdays, to review all the cases judged in the local tribunals. On December 7th, 1965, on the eve of the end of the Council Vatican II, the Pope changed the name of the Congregation of the Holy Office into that of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith, which still exists. Because of the dispersion of the archives and documents which occur over the years, it is difficult to establish the number of processes and that of the death sentences executed by the 48 local seats of the Inquisition. We know that 128 people were burned at the stake at Rome. A rough calculation suggests that in the 4 centuries of activity of the Holy Office, 11 to 1400 of people were executed throughout Italy. The last death sentence was carried out in 1761. About half of the sentences were against Protestants. The others concerned diabolical witchcraft, men who administered the confession or celebrated Mass without being ordained priests, and against Judaizing Jews and Muslims. The Spanish Inquisition was most ferocious, carrying out more than 12,000 death sentences. The repression played an important role in preventing the spread of Protestant ideas in Italy. Many were those who chose the path of exile. Italian Protestant churches were founded abroad, in Geneva, Zurich, and in London, and Italian branches of the Geneva Church were established in Paris, Lyon, and Antwerp. Italian Protestant churches were then active in Valtellina, which from 1512 was under the control of the Swiss canton of the Grisons. The Grisons joined the Reformation in the 1530s, and therefore since then, also in Valtellina, for several decades, coexistence between Protestant and Catholics was practiced. This experiment of coexistence between different religious confessions, however, ended in blood in 1620, when a pro-Spanish revolt against the domination of the Grisons led to the massacre of hundreds of Protestants. Between 400 and 600 people were killed. The only other place that saw a Protestant presence in the Italian peninsula were the valleys west of Pinerolo in Piemonte, part of the Duchy of Savoy, where most of the population were Waldensians. These areas of the Western Alps, since the Middle Ages, had seen the presence of heretical groups that not even the last great crusade internal to Christianity in 1487 had wiped out. The Waldenses, who did not speak Italian, but a French dialect, established relationships with the Swiss Protestant, and in 1532 formally joined the Reformation, becoming Calvinist church. For 30 years, the Waldensian mountains resisted in arms to any attempt of the Duke of Savoy to bring them back to Catholicism. On June 5, 1561, in Cavour, a peace treaty between the representatives of the Waldensian communities and those of the Duke of Savoy was signed. This treaty granted religious freedom to the Waldenses in precise and defined territorial limits. The agreement was condemned by Rome, and the Waldensian communities, which then existed also in Calabria, were massacred in the same year with thousands of deaths. Since then, the Waldensian valleys were a sort of en plein air ghetto. In a dozen of mountain municipalities, around 15,000 Waldensians could build temples, organize schools, and have pastor training in Geneva. The Waldenses could not move outside the prescribed areas of the valleys mentioned in the treaty, the High Val Luserna, Val San Martino, Val Perosa. We don't find the expression ghetto to define the Waldensian valleys in any document of the time. This was an expression coined in the 19th century and since then much used in the historiography. But even though it was not a space enclosed by walls, the term ghetto well describes the idea of a space that allowed the presence of people of different religions in a Catholic country. The valleys had very well defined and precise boundaries. The Cavour Treaty is in fact the first edict of tolerance issued in Europe, which surpassed the principle of cuius regio eius religio, enshrined in the Peace of Augsburg of 1555, which stated that the empire subjects were to follow the religion of their ruler. Over the years, Waldensians' families settled outside the limits set up by the Treaty of Cavour. In 1655, an ordinance imposed to the Waldenses who had settled in these areas either to convert to Catholicism or to leave their homes. A massacre followed in which it has been estimated that about 1,700 men and women were killed, and 148 children were taken away from their valleys and given to Catholic families to be educated as such. The massacre provoked the indignation of the Protestant world, and the memory of the Protestant anger was enshrined by John Milton in a famous sonnet. The Waldensian valleys, the ghetto of the Alps, represented thus the only area of religious freedom in the Italian peninsula after the massacres of the Waldensians of Calabria and of the Protestants of Valtellina. The native inhabitants of those places experimented over the years practice of tolerance and coexistence. It was only with the patent letters granted by Duke Carlo Alberto of Savoy to the Waldensian on February 17, 1848, that the terms of the Treaty of Cavour were overcome. The patent letters granted to the Waldensians the possibility of building temples outside of the 13 parishes of the valleys. The Waldenses set in Turin and Genoa, and after the unification of Italy, they adopted the Italian language instead of French and established churches throughout the peninsula in every major city. Except from the Waldensian valleys, in all Italian states, Protestants and foreign non-Catholics were not allowed to stay, even temporary, and those who were found ran the risk to be persecuted as former heretics. Every year, on Holy Thursday, the bull in Cena Domini was solemnly read in Latin and Italian from the loggia of St. Peter's Basilica. This papal document listed the most serious cases punishable by excommunication, and at least since 1610, the excommunication was clearly prescribed for all the Hussites, Wycliffites, Lutherans, Zwinglians, Calvinists, Huguenots, Anabaptists, and anti-Trinitarian apostates of the Christian faith. Those who were aware of the presence of heretics were obliged to report them to the Inquisition. In 1592, Italian Catholics were explicitly forbidden to live in countries where Mass was not celebrated openly. In 1623, Gregory XV issued the bull Romani Pontifici, which reiterated the ban for heretics to travel in Italy. From a purely theoretical point of view, a Protestant persecuted by the Inquisition had only the option to choose between the conversion to Catholicism and the condemnation as a relapsed heretic, to which followed the transfer into the hands of the secular authorities to carry out the death sentence. If the legislation excluded in such a precise and dramatic manner the possibility for heretics to travel, trade, and settle in a Catholic country, in reality, things run in a complete different way. Since the 16th century, flexible practices corresponded to the draconian rule, and heretic travelers who would behave in a prudent and judicious way were usually left entirely undisturbed. It is obviously clear that the presence of a strict rule, even if not always applied, left ample space to an arbitrary and arrogant discretion. Therefore, over the years, the Protestant countries try, often successfully, to introduce elements of protection for Protestants who needed to travel in Catholic countries. For example, after the approval of the peace treaty between Spain and England in 1605, its provisions regarding the protection of British travelers from any persecution of the Spanish Inquisition were in fact extended also in the Mediterranean countries under the jurisdiction of the Roman Inquisition. The only conditions that were imposed on them were not to do any kind of religious propaganda, not to behave without giving scandal in the eyes of Catholics. That means not to publicly express their adherence to a non-Catholic faith. These flexible practices led to the establishment in many parts of the Italian peninsula of some communities of foreign Protestants as permanent residents. In early modern Italy, foreign non-Catholics live in the great trading cities of the Italian peninsula: Venice, Milan, Genoa, Livorno, Rome, Naples. In the Republic of Venice, non-Catholic foreigners study at the University of Padua, where students who came from Protestant lands had a special status, or serve as soldiers in the fortress of Palmanova. In the north, there was a continuous osmosis between the Catholic and the Protestant world, with merchants and craftsmen who moved from place to place. In other Italian cities, the presence of non-Catholic foreigners were very limited, often temporary, and due to the individual choices that in their singularity escape to a general rule. Of course, especially in northern Italy, most of these foreign heretics were from Germany. There were also, depending on the place, French Huguenots, Dutch Calvinists, schismatic Greeks and Armenians. Non-Catholic British had a structured presence only in Venice, Genoa, Naples, and Livorno. In the latter city, in the 17th century, German-speaking and English-speaking Protestant communities were established. A de facto tolerance towards Protestant merchants was also granted in the port cities of Nice, in the Duchy of Savoy, and Civitavecchia and Ancona, in the Papal States. In all these places, Protestants were asked to do their best not to be recognized as such, because in theory it was impossible for them to reside in any Italian state. They were not demanded to reside in a particular part of the city. On the contrary, they were requested to adopt mimetic strategies to avoid being discovered, as, for example, not to eat meat during holidays of obligations. A typical example of this practice common to all the Catholic country that for commercial reasons saw Protestant presence is that of Livorno, where non-Catholic merchants were protected by a motu proprio issued by the Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1593, the so-called Livornina. This decree, designed to protect from the Inquisition the Jewish conversos who desired to settle in Livorno, was addressed to the merchants of whatever nation, Levantini and Ponentini, Spanish, Portuguese, Greeks and Germans, Italian Jews, Turks and Moors, Armenians, Persians and others. Gradually, the Livornina became a point of reference for all non-Catholic Christians who wanted to settle in Tuscany. Between the end of the 1500s and the early 1600s, not many British and Dutch settled in Livorno. Those who did so were often ship captains in the service of the Grand Duke. Less frequently, they were merchants. And although there were no precise data, very often they were Catholic. It was only in the 1620s, when the English and Dutch mercantile presence increased in number, that gradually the Protestant element emerged, becoming predominant in a few years. There were a few dozen people, and almost all of them were bachelors or had left their wives' home, clearly showing that, at least in their intention, their stay in Livorno was conceived as temporary. Eventually, the growing foreign presence led to the establishment of formal national communities, the Nazioni, officially recognized by the Tuscan government, a structure with their own statutes and self-governing bodies headed by a council. We did not have diplomatic status and only represented the mercantile community. The German presence in Livorno, at least until the middle of the 18th century, was completely negligible. The few German merchants within the early modern age resided in Livorno joined the Dutch nation, which in fact was called Dutch-German Nation, Nazione Olandese Germanica. There was also a small garrison of German soldiers, and a number of abjuration of these soldiers make us think that among them the majority were Protestants. It must be emphasized that the tolerance granted to the Protestants of Livorno was a limited and controlled one, which offered to them neither the freedom of worship nor the possibility of religious proselytism, not to bury with decorum and dignity their dead. On the contrary, it allowed Catholic proselytism and inquisitorial control over them. Gradually, with the growth of importance of their mercantile communities, British and Dutch started to feel uneasy with the strict limits imposed on their freedom, and sought to widen the space of tolerance. The history of the Protestant presence in Livorno in the 17th and 18th century is thus also the history of the conflict of these communities with the political and religious Tuscan authority to assert their right to live openly their religious beliefs. The first to claim this right were the British, who since 1644 tried several times to have a Protestant minister for their community. Very significantly, the Tuscan authorities, both locally and centrally, were well aware of the fact that a Protestant worship was practiced in the city and did not raise any objections. However, every time that the Protestant went over and above the limit of desirable discretion and the presence of this Protestant minister became publicly known, the Inquisition intervened, forcing the state authorities to expel them. Between 1644 and 1670, we know at least of 10 expulsions. It was only in 1697 that the ambassador's chaplain could informally exercise his ministry, also for the English mercantile community of Livorno, thanks to extraterritoriality granted to the English diplomats. At first, this happened, if not secretly, with discretion and prudence, then since 1707, openly and publicly. This change was obtained by England, threatening to break off diplomatic relations with Tuscany if they did not agree to this request, and even menacing military intervention. However, it is significant that even after 1707, it was explicitly asked to the British that the buildings where the Protestant congregation met should not be recognizable in any way as a chapel or a church, in contrast to the Jewish synagogues, which are to be clearly recognizable. In the case of Protestant places of worship, they ask a sort of invisibility. In the 1640s, the Dutch and the English communities of Livorno were allowed to have graveyards where they could erect individual tombs. Almost certainly before then, they buried their dead in anonymous common graves. All these cemeteries, for almost half a century, however, could not be fenced. Fences to protect the burials of not Catholic from animals and grave robbers were asked in 1685 by the Dutch and in 1706 by the English. Difficult negotiations followed. The Dutch at first raised the issue, first fenced their cemetery as early as 1695. The English could do so only in 1746. One of the reasons which prevented the erection of walls around the non-Catholic cemeteries was the fear that the religious rites could be celebrated there, unseen from the outside. And for this reason, even when eventually the construction of a wall was permitted, this had to be short enough to allow those who were outside to see what was going on inside the cemetery. The religious authorities wanted to affirm so, in a symbolic way, the fact that the burial of heretics had nothing to do with religion. And for that reason, much attention was devoted to forbid Catholics to attend any Protestant funeral service. The Protestants in Livorno live all over the city. The richest in the central streets, the other in less prestigious areas. The same thing, as far as you know, can be said of all the Italian cities in which there was a foreign presence. The coexistence in the same urban space the coexistence in the same urban space led inevitably to process of assimilation, especially among the less wealthy foreigners. In 1616, the Inquisitor of Turin complained that Swiss merchant married Catholic women whose children he did not know which church they belonged to. We know of dozens of foreign Protestants who, having decided to settle in Italy forever, converted to Catholicism. In some, there were no Protestant ghettos in Italy. On the contrary, as we have pointed out, Protestants were asked to be as invisible as possible. To formally admit the presence of organized Protestant congregations beyond the violation of the canon law would have meant to admit that it was possible to be a Christian without being Catholic. And this was inconceivable. The closest thing to a Christian ghetto is the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, the German Fondaco in Venice. This ethnic institution was established well before the Reformation in the mercantile center of the city, close to the Rialto Bridge. The fondaci were medieval buildings that in the maritime Mediterranean cities were used as warehouse and often also to accommodate the foreign merchants. The words come from Arabic, funduk, literally warehouse, house. Between the 11th and the 14th century, fondaci were built all over the Mediterranean. Gradually, they lost their shelter function and became essentially places where they levied custom taxes. With the 1500s, the great period of the fondaci had concluded. The end of this system was determined mainly by the impact of the fall of Constantinople in Turkish hands and on the Mediterranean trade, with the consequent search of new Atlantic routes and the progressive shifting of commercial axis to the northern Europe. The Fondaco dei Tedeschi in Venice, established in 1228, following the model of Venetian fondaci in Byzantium and in the Islamic countries, was the only one of this medieval structure to survive in the Italian peninsula. The structure permanently housed about 100 and 120 German merchants, in addition to a larger number of workers, as cooks and couriers. The Venetian state had the direction of the Fondaco. Every German merchant was obliged to stay in the Fondaco. The boatmen who ferried them to Venice from the mainland were forbidden to take them to another place that was not the Fondaco. A personal interpreter was assigned to every merchant, and he was supposed to assist him in all his dealings, and of course to control him. Entering the Fondaco, the merchants had to hand over their weapons and their money. As a matter of fact, many of these measures were meant to prevent tax fraud. In 1505, the building of the Fondaco caught fire. The Republic gave order to immediately rebuild it at its own expenses. The speed with which this decision was taken and realized clearly shows the economic importance that the Republic attributed to the German presence. The new Fondaco, completed in 1508, was a compact, beautiful, and harmonic building decorated with fresco by Giorgione and Titian. On the ground floor, on a square courtyard, there were the shops. In the 2 floors above, there were the houses for the merchant and the refectory. Many of the German merchants in Venice joined the Reformation. Already in 1529, the Pope lamented that the Fondaco was a center of heretical propaganda. In subsequent years, of the 16th century, we have not much information about the religious life of the Fondaco. The silence of the sources led us to think that in all probability the Republic was able to obtain a cautious attitude on the part of the German community, offering its political protection in exchange of prudent behaviors that would avoid any scandal. These dynamics were clearly similar to those we have just described for the Tuscan scenario. But everyone knew that the Fondaco dei Tedeschi was a nest of heretics. In 1634, the Apostolic Nuncio of Venice wrote to the Congregation of the Holy Office that in the Fondaco dei Tedeschi in Rialto, almost all the merchants were heretics. In the changing religious climate that followed the end of the 30-Year Wars in 1650, a first Lutheran pastor, disguised as a physician, moved in the Fondaco. He started to secretly celebrate the Protestant cult in 2 rooms on the 3rd floor of the building. At Easter 1651, about 150 Lutherans did the communion. The presence of the successor to the first minister was denounced in 1654, and the request of the nuncio, he was expelled from Venice. This expulsion provoked a major turning point in the life of the German Protestant community of Venice, which, to avoid possible future problems, worked out a set of articles which organized the worship rigorously to ensure the secrecy of the community. There were clear provisions for newcomers and prescription on how to access the worship hall without arousing suspicion. In addition to the detailed longer version, they also prepared an abbreviated document that was read to the younger new members at the time of their entry in the community. The Fondaco, and I'm going to finish, was clear at the same time both an institution of coexistence and of separation. It is not unlikely that when the decision to establish the Jewish ghetto was made, the German structure has in some measure represented a model for this project. In this brief overview, we have examined the 3 models of interreligious coexistence that developed in the early modern times in Italy towards Protestant. The unplanned ghetto of the Valdensian valleys, the de facto tolerance granted to foreign Protestants in Livorno and other mercantile cities, provided they did not publicly express their belonging to a church different from the Catholic one, and the Fondaco dei Tedeschi in Venice, a sort of Christian ghetto on ethnic grounds, which reproduces the multi-confessional of the German nation. The study of this practice of limited tolerance in the Italy of Counter-Reformation is obviously significant in itself to investigate the methods that have allowed to maintain commercial relationship outside the confessional boundaries. Beyond this, however, in the 5th century of the founding of the ghetto, the study of these events may perhaps be useful to study Jewish history in a context that goes beyond the tragic history of anti-Semitism. Thank you.
I'm going to invite both of our speakers to the podium now, and we'll have a question and answer period. If we have to cut off the question and answer period, please do not be alarmed, because we will have a reception following this, and I hope you'll take that as an opportunity to talk with our speakers and our scholars. I believe we have microphones, so if you'll raise your hand, a microphone will come to you.
I think it's working. Professor Cooperman, you indicated that besides Venice, there were other fairly large Jewish communities throughout Europe at the time. Did any of these communities replicate the segregation that existed in Venice, be it in Amsterdam or any of the other areas?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of the surprising things that came to me as I did this work was to realize that Venice, even though the word ghetto, I have no doubt, comes from Venice, in fact, the idea of spatial segregation as a way of allowing the community in goes back much further. Frankfurt, the Jews are expelled by the merchants of Frankfurt, and the Bishop of Frankfurt builds an area right next to the gate of the city to accommodate 100 Jews. It was a very ample area, By the time the Rothschilds lived there, it had, it's estimated 3,000 Jews living in that same space. So these places become very attractive, and the same method is used. In other words, what you have is the merchants control the zoning within the walls, and they want the Jews out, but the bishop, who wants the Jewish taxes and their contributions to the economy or whatever, or wants them there as Jews, gives them a space in his territory. The same thing can be seen in Krakow. One of the beautiful things you have here, one of the treasures of the Library of Congress, is the Nuremberg Chronicle. Nuremberg Chronicle was published in 1490. And it is one of the most elegantly and beautifully illustrated geographic, it's kind of like an atlas and a picture book and a history book. And if you look at Krakow there, you will see that there's the city of Krakow, and then just across a little bridge, there's a city known as Kazimierz, or in Polish it's called Kazimierz. And Kazimierz, the Jews had lived in Krakow. There had also been Jews in Kazimierz. There are two separate jurisdictions. When the Jews are eventually forced out by the merchants of Krakow, they are put in the ghetto of Kazimierz. But it's not a ghetto. It's a separate city. There is a wall around the Jewish district, but the Jews control it. And in fact, the rest of the city of Kazimierz is very angry at the Jews because they don't take care of the sewage and they don't maintain the wall, and they're very angry at them. But again, you see that same kind of thing. So the idea is done in many areas. Now, in Amsterdam, there is no wall, and in Livorno, there is no wall. That's one of the important things about Livorno and Pisa. There was never in Livorno or Pisa a formal area. But Livorno and Pisa are a customs zone, and Jews can't go out elsewhere in Tuscany. So there is a ghetto. It just doesn't have physical walls. It has economic walls, right? And the Duke of Tuscany said, I'm going to make the Jews build this wall, and they're going to pay for it. And the Jews didn't want to pay for it. So, I don't know how that comes up all the time. Sorry.
Yeah, it's on? I have several questions, one to each one of you. First of all, Yanni, you went through a whole list of different historical features. Can you outline to us where you got the sources from? These are 500-year-old data. I mean, I would think that there weren't computers 500 years ago. And where did you just elaborated on the facts. Where do you do your research and where your sources are?
Yeah, do I have to answer? No? Yes. I work extensively on the records of the Inquisition in Rome, and many of the things that I'm saying here actually can be based on some of the documents of the Inquisition. So, for example, in very recent times, I've been working on the hundreds of abjuration of Protestants, and from the abjuration, they are very formalized documents. You usually think that this document in which people presented themselves in front of the Inquisitor and converted to Catholicism are really conversion narratives. On the contrary, they are very bureaucratic documents. They are more similar to the form that you are filling up for the green card than for a real narrative conversion. And you can get some of the data for this. In the case of the Fondaco dei Tedeschi, a lot of work has been done since the 19th century. There are 2 huge volumes edited by German scholars that dug up all the documents in the Venetian archives. So it really, and then I mean, in the case of Livorno, that is probably the place that I know best. There are documents as well in the correspondence of the local state authorities with the Grand Duke of Tuscany. So it's really, I was presenting here a short summary of a major research. I'm planning actually to write a book on the presence of Protestant foreigners in Italy, and so in the book you will find all the reference.
Same question to Mr. Koopman. Where do you get your resources from? Same kind of thing. Basically, one of the things that my own teachers did not realize was that there are many more documents about Jews in general archives than there are in Jewish archives. That's an interesting question. Jews are overrepresented in general archives. And I'm not sure why. There are all kinds of theories as to why this might be, but I think one of the reasons is basically what I was talking about in terms of the ghetto. The Jews, you see, in a city, Jews don't have any of the mechanisms that other people can use to defend themselves. They're not part of the guild. They don't have a cousin who's the mayor of the city. They don't have access to the levers of power. And so what they do is they go to court, and they go to court all the time. And there are people who think that Jews were always afraid of going to non-Jewish courts and that they only went to rabbis. Baloney. It's not at all true. Jews trusted the non-Jewish courts. They knew what the non-Jewish courts were. They knew they could rely on them, especially in Italy. I mean, as much as you can ever rely on a court, you know. But these were established legal procedures.
My question's for Professor Cooperman. So, you know, I'm with you in terms of pushing back against you know, the kind of modern idea that the medieval or early modern ghettos, that these were essentially prisons that, you know, had no redeeming features whatsoever. But I wonder if there's maybe like a little bit of a kind of overcorrection in this revision in terms of, you know, when you start using analogies to gated communities, you know, or when you just kind of say things like, well, we have to understand that, you know, these kinds of ethnic religious factions, this was just par for the course in pre-modern societies. I mean, there was something new about the kind of segregation that was being instituted in Venice. And yes, okay, so you have precursors like Frankfurt, and the idea to some extent goes back further. But, you know, the notion of creating an area that Jews must live in, and only Jews can live in. In other words, this isn't just the kind of basically open Jewish quarter that's densely Jewish, but has Christians who live, you know, I mean, there's real separation here. The idea of surveillance, right, that, you know, yeah, okay, so maybe the idea of a Jewish quarter having a wall around it, you know, that's older, but the idea of these areas being guarded, the idea of, you know, you have to brick over any kind of outward-facing windows or doors, and there's real scrupulousness about that. So I'm saying, you know, are you kind of undermining a little bit the importance of the concept of segregation in terms of the early modern Jewish ghetto?
Excuse me, are you suggesting that I would reach for a joke and say ridiculous things? You know, well, let me say, of course you're right, but you're wrong. Okay, and I'll try to very briefly. I mean, I can go on, as you might know, for hours. But let me say this. First of all, I tried to hint at something that's very important, and that is that groups living together, right, the idea that everything will be hunky-dory and everybody will all go to each other's bar mitzvahs and confirmations and will all drink wine together and so forth and so on, although in Italy they did drink wine together, but that's another thing. But that kind of idea that, like, I have students who say to me, wait a minute, Jews live separately, or Jews live, who did they play with on the street? And the answer is they played with other Jews, if they played at all. Why would you think? But they didn't go to school together. There were no common schools, you ding-dong. Right, this is my kids, not my students, not you, right? But we look at the world from the assumptions of the 21st century. We project it back and say, well, but if it wasn't like that, that must mean something. And what the meaning we give it are the meaning. We use things like surveillance. These societies surveilled everybody. You know, these are small places. If a foreign merchant came to London, just what Professor Villani was talking about with the Fonteco dei Tedeschi in Venice. If a foreign merchant came to London, they immediately had the innkeeper write down everything he brought in, everything he took out, and we have these records. The government kept records. Surveillance is not the new thing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, obviously there are anxieties when groups that are truly different from each other and ideologically different from each other live next door to each other. The social anxieties, cultural anxieties, if we in America, with all of our Facebook and all of our money and everything, can't live in peace with each other, then how much more so? And of course, it gets worse at times of economic downturn, at times of war tensions, all kinds of things like that. So yes, obviously, they are separate communities. The problem is, though, that we understand that difference as if it is the antithesis of our perfect society. Our society ain't perfect, and that was the 16th century, not the 21st century.
Thank you. My wife and I, in a small group, just came back last month from 3 weeks exploring Jewish Italy. And the Italian people are wonderful. They are wonderful. I can't say that.
Clearly, he ate a lot of pasta.
No, I had a little blog with the group because I took a lot of photographs, and I just was exciting examples of the friendship. My wife had to go to the bathroom. I forgot in Montepulciano, and the lady left the restaurant alone. There was no one in the restaurant, and she took her to go to the bathroom.
For this, you had to come for him to talk about you going to the bathroom.
Well, there is a bathroom here, so she came.
No Italian would have gotten away with saying that about his wife in a public place.
But we learned that in the 15th century, Italy was basically a group of states. And correct me if I'm... in the central and southern part, it was ruled by the papacy. When a lot of the Sephardic Jews came to Italy, they didn't like being under their rule, and so at the invitation of many towns and wealthy families like the Medicis and in Ferrara, the Este family, they came there. But when the families moved away, or in the case of the Este family in Ferrara, when the last person died and there was no heir, the papacy came in and took away a lot of the freedoms of the Jews, took away a lot of the businesses, and set up the ghetto. So my question really is that in many areas the Jews lived without a ghetto, and they lived very happily with the general community. So why do you feel that the ghetto was something that the Jews would want to live in?
So, listen, first of all, I have to say that Professor Villani is much more of an expert on general Italian policy and the papacy in Italy and its attitudes, its general history. So I'll say something, and then maybe you want to clarify and tell me what I missed. But let me just say this. First of all, the description that you've been given, or the description that you repeated here, is correct, but fundamentally too simplistic, okay? So, for example, the very first charter to Spanish and Portuguese Jews to openly practice Judaism, even though they had been living as Christians, even though they had been baptized, et cetera, was given in papal Ancona in 1514, and then in the 1530s and 1540s. So it is simply not true that it was a simple arbitrary decision or difference between the papal authority and the non-papal. But the question that was asked before is relevant here. I have argued, and I've written about this, and I'm trying to write more about it, that the ghetto is really a product of commercial competition. But as in our society, right, I keep pointing back to our society because it's the model that sits in front of us. Historians are not supposed to use anachronistic models. But in our society, when people talked about discrimination against African Americans during slavery or after slavery, right? After 1863, during Jim Crow, after the Civil Rights Movement, and so forth and so on, we use a rhetoric about they and us. And that rhetoric is based on anthropological or pseudo-anthropological categories or sociological. They are like that, you know, those people. And it doesn't matter what the people are, but we use those terms. But that's not what's going on. That's the words we use to justify what is very often a power play, a commerce play, a control of money. If you want to understand, for example, the riots in Baltimore, the first thing you should look at is the way money is allocated by the City Council of Baltimore and by the banks of Baltimore to allow, you know, building in certain parts of the city as opposed to other parts of the city. You know, very often it has a lot more to do with economics and things. So out there you have the papal decree of the ghetto. The Venetian ghetto is 1516. The papal ghetto, cum nimis absurdum, is 1555. And there are all kinds of books that will tell you that the popes, it's because it's Paulo IV, Paul IV, who is a carafa, who is a crazy guy. Everybody in Rome hated him. Everybody was so happy when he died that they danced in the streets and they burned all his papers and so forth and so on. And he was an old fanatic and an anti-Semite and everything like that. And so there's a famous book by one of my colleagues, one of my friends, who wrote about how the ghetto in 1555 is part of a conversionary policy by the popes. There's only one problem with that. That's not what it says. What it says is, Jews are moving into the nicest streets in Rome. What the hey? I forget exactly how they say that in Italian. But they say, excuse me, Jews should live in their part of the city, and we're going to put up a wall. Now, what I'm saying is, yes, religious rhetoric is used, and I'm not saying that the church didn't become obsessed with the Jews. It certainly did. It always has been, and I said the church was the most tolerant, that the church was the reason for the survival of the Jews, but there are periods, especially in the 19th century, when Italy is unifying and papal control is being threatened, the papacy becomes reactionary in a way that's astonishing, and it backs off of many of the principles that it itself had stood for centuries. All right, good. We know that in times of trouble, societies, you know, change, and they become more restrictive. I mean, we've seen it in our society many, many times in the hundreds of years of America, which isn't that long, in the few hundred years of American history. But what happens is that these themes become more powerful. And yes, they become part of an institutionalized. That's really what Professor Villani and his teachers, and there's this whole project about the Inquisition, that's what they work on, the way the Inquisition really is a bureaucratic institution. Part of you know, that kind of thing. So yes, that happens, but it's not as simple as, oh, the Spanish Jews didn't, because in fact the Spanish Jews are very happy to live in Rome. They fight like hell to live in Rome, and Alexander VI, who does not get the best press in papal history, was very nice to the Spanish Jews and made the Jews of Rome let them in. Maybe you want to say something else?
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank you gentlemen, the Library of Congress, and the government of Italy for bringing joy to my heart on this topic. I'm an armchair historian and come from a family of Sephardic rabbis. My thinking was that the Jews that were brought to Rome to build the Colosseum were the first Jews brought to Italy, I guess officially. That's not true?
No.
Can you expand upon that?
No, they didn't build the Colosseum, but the argument is that Titus brought Jews as slaves. And everybody will take you to the Arch of Titus. Did you go to the Arch of Titus when you were in Italy? Yeah, the thing? All right, so the destruction of the temple is 70. Jews think it's 68, but it's apparently 70. And you have that arch, and you see the menorah, for supposedly the menorah, for there are arguments about it, but people usually say, and they say these Jews are brought as slaves, and there are wonderful poems by, if any of you know the Hebrew poetry of Yud Lamed Gordon and so forth, was it Yud Lamed Gordon? Yeah, I think it was Yud Lamed Gordon, about the slaves who perished, you know, with the lions, you know, and they eat them and all that kind of stuff. It's a great story. The truth is that when the Maccabees won in 165 BCE, right? So that's a long time. That's 230 years before the destruction of the Second Temple. When they come, they send an ambassador to Rome, and the Jews in town meet them there and are very happy and celebrate them. So Jews had been living in Rome from at least the 2nd century BCE. No. The ghetto was 1555. They lived all over the city.
Please continue this conversation as part of the reception and the display. I would like to take this opportunity, however, to thank and introduce you to the curators of the display, particularly Lucia Wolf, who brought the idea that the commemoration of the 500 years of the Venetian ghetto was a topic that the Law Library and the European Division of the Library of Congress should present to the community. And so thank you, Lucia, Nathan Dorn, Anthony Mullen, and Ann Brenner, who are our wonderful curators and are anxious to talk to you more in the room just behind this one about the collection. And please, please continue the conversation over a glass of wine. If you would be so kind to also fill out the evaluation form that should have been in your program, it will help us in the future to make wonderful programs like this. And thank you so much for coming.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.